All right, this is part two of a video series of a lecture for Natural Resources Ecology, a class at SUNY ESF. We talked about human use of landscapes and forests and rock walls as indications of prior land use. So this is part two. Part two. So if we think about the landscape that existed in New York systems before the arrival and domination of white settlers from Europe, there was already a strong human presence in these landscapes, and Native people in the Americas used and managed these forests in many ways. And as we learn more, we're beginning to the more we learn, the more we understand the impact and dramatic use of human peoples on the structure and function of ecosystems in North America, even before white settlers arrived. And so recognizing the impact of Native peoples, we often conceptualize the forests before their arrival as being subject to ongoing natural and human disturbances, but to exist in a wide variety of different age, density, and size classes of different forests that existed, with a wide range of different tree species. And this is exemplified by this picture of an actual physical diorama that exists at Harvard Forest in Petersham, Massachusetts. And they have this beautiful set of diagrams that show the structure of forests in the Northeast following a time series of human use. And so this is an artist's rendition of what the forests might have looked like before white settlers arrived. In the kind of the middle part of the 1700s, much of this forest was just started to be cleared by humans, primarily of European descent, that individual families often moved westward and created settlements of individualized parcels where one person and his family would clear this forest. They would use the surrounding forest for hunting and trapping, but they would clear land. They would and to create agricultural fields that they could cultivate for crops that they were used to growing back in their home countries of their original descent. And you can see a farmer here in this diorama has cleared the native forest and has moved much of the rocks that were present in the soil and created rock walls around his cultivated field. And again, he's not trying to really create a wall around his field. He's just trying to get the rocks out of that soil, and it's a convenient source to create a rock wall. And so this existed in kind of patchwork manner as different settlers are clearing and utilizing land in this way. So transforming this landscape that was dominated by forests to a more pastoral or rural landscape that included small-scale domestication. In about the mid of the 1800s, here shown in 1830s, this process has occurred quite widely and extensively, where a very large fraction of this forested landscape had been cleared and used for farming. So this landscape has changed. The family farm is still there, but is now surrounded by a landscape of many other family farms. So in this case, 60 to 80% of the land was cleared and used for human uses. And it was a patchwork of different uses, but agricultural crops, pasture land, but importantly, some woodlots remained as these people that lived in this landscape utilized these woodlots for firewood. In the later period of the 19th century, starting in about the 1850s, the country becomes more connected, particularly with the development of railroads and westward expansion and the ability of motorized equipment to clear some of the lands in the Midwest and creating much more fertile farmland, and a movement of people and the ability to transport goods meant that it became less economically feasible to continue agriculture in the Northeast. There was also the abandonment of farms associated with the Civil War. And so many farmlands in the late 1800s were abandoned, and forests often regrew in those places. And so in much of in the Northeast, the trees that tended to grow up were early successional tree species, and one important one was white pine, although there was a large variety of species that grew up in different places and depended on the availability of seed in the surrounding woodlots and the street trees that were left. But white pines were an important component of the trees that grew up. This is an example of some of the things that were happening in the country at the time. This is a photo of the golden spike that was used to complete and connect the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific Railroads in 1869. That completed a transcontinental railroad system for the United States and signified this broader change about the transportation of people and goods across large landscapes. This is one of the reasons that people left farming in the Northeast. This is the bushels of corn that were produced in the year 2010, and you can see that currently a lot of our agricultural production, particularly for corn, occurs in the Midwest. You can see Iowa and Illinois popping out as important areas for corn productivity now because those soils are deeper, more organic, and they have less rocks. They tend to be better for agriculture, and comparatively better than many of the rocky, thin, and poor soils in the Northeast. So much of this farming that was happening in the 1800s, early 1800s in the Northeast, was those farmlands were abandoned as those people and the production of agricultural goods shifted towards the Midwest. And here's a map of soil organic matter that reflects that difference, and you can see the colors, or the degree to which this is brown, indicates the distribution of soil organic matter. And you can see the very rich soils, particularly of Iowa and southern Minnesota, popping out in here, compared to the soils of moderate fertility in much of the Northeast. Okay, so here is, again, returning to those Harvard forest dioramas, a depiction of what the forests might have looked like in the early 1900s and in the 1910, where we have a landscape that's still a patchwork. There's still some farmlands existing, but we have largely a forested landscape that emphasizes white pine. And these are old fields, so-called old field white pines that grew up on abandoned agricultural lands, on old fields. And by the early 1910s, these white pines had reached a size that they became valuable. And here we see a relatively small operation of felling of these white pines, these two guys working here in the foreground. And at this time, pine was used for many things. It was used for box boards and shipping containers before the invention of corrugated cardboard. In many places, not every place, but in many places, these old field white pines, after they were cut and removed, they were replaced by a whole suite of other different hardwood species, of slightly later successional species. White pine can't resprout after cutting. Some of the other hardwoods can. And so this management of cutting, and also the time, since agricultural abandonment led to the increased diversity of the trees that existed in the Northeast as a patchwork of different lands of different management histories. And here again is this artistic depiction of the same place. We've been following the same geographic location of this vigorously regrowing hardwood stand that is regrowing after pine cutting. And so particularly species that regrow well from sprouting, sprout prolifically, things like red oak, red maple, and a number of other species are strongly represented here. And so when we go out and we look at a modern forest landscape, when we look at the species that are present and their sizes, we should remember that we are seeing the legacy of prior land use decisions and the role of economic forces about railroad development that have influenced human land use decisions that then influence the structure and composition of the forests that we currently see. There has been remarkable expansion of maturing forests, particularly in the Northeast, and a change in that species composition over time. And next time you're walking through the woods and you see those rock walls, I would encourage you to remember this legacy of land use that has influenced the ecosystems that you find yourself surrounded in. This is data from a paper by Daniel Foster that focuses on central Massachusetts, particularly this site in Petersham where Harvard Forest currently is. But it reflects a regional process that is also at play in New York. And we can see this is the estimation of the percent land cover for a couple of different places. Massachusetts as a whole, the town of Petersham here in these open symbols where those Harvard Forest dioramas come from, and then one particular forest in Petersham. And so early here, just to review what we talked about, early in the early 1700s, there was an enormous and large fraction of the landscape was covered in forests. Those forests were removed, and much of the landscape was transformed into agricultural use. There was perhaps 25 or 50%, maybe less than 50% of the land did remain in forest, as some land was intentionally left that way because landowners needed a source of firewood to heat their homes. And after the railroad development, after the Civil War, which was happening in the 1860s to 1880s, we have a lot of agricultural abandonment and regrowth of forests on abandoned agricultural fields. So let's talk a little bit more about some aspects of northeastern forests. What I'm about to show you comes largely from a report from the U.S. Forest Service. And what's different, there's a strong geographic difference in forest ownership in the United States. The eastern forests are primarily owned by private landowners. Some companies and large forest operations that own their own land, but it's predominantly owned by small-time private landowners that own relatively small parcels. It's very different out west, where a lot of the forest is owned federally and managed by Bureau of Land Management, for example. So there's a very, very distinct difference in forest ownership. And quite a lot of the forest doesn't actually have a management plan. These are small holdings of individual people that own a bit of woods, perhaps with a cabin in it. But a larger portion of the forests that is privately owned does have management plans. These tend to be held by investment groups that are actively managing these forests for economic returns. Forests also really strongly differ in their age in the different geographic regions of the country. So in the south, particularly the southeast, with large-scale industrial pine plantations, forestry in particular, those forests tend to be, a lot of that forest is young, reflecting a 30-year rotation of pine forestry in the southeast. In the northeast, a lot of our forests are kind of this middle age classes, reflecting a broad landscape scale pulse of deforestation and then afforestation as those forests developed about 60 or 70 years ago on a graded forest land. And out west, it's very bimodal. We have some young forests in active management, this pulse in the middle, and some very old forests that tend not to be managed. And the way forestry is practiced in these different regions is reflected in this data about how many millions of acres was planted in each region. And you can see that in the south, plantings particularly planting pines, is a really big business of active management, including planting of specific species and even specific kinds of pines that have desirable quantities. But you can see in the north, we tend not to regenerate our forests with direct planting, and we rely more on natural revegetation or on silvicultural practices that emphasize the kind of natural regeneration that we would like to see. And so I'm going to stop there, and this is the end of part 2. We are going to transition into a discussion of maple syrup production as an example of a human land use decision, as a prelude to a sugar bush exercise at Heiberg Forest. And so now I would encourage you at the end of this video to watch an additional video that some of the forest property staff at Heiberg Forest put together about how trees are tapped for sugar production, the production of maple syrup at Heiberg Forest.